For years, Paul McCartney kept quiet about the last time he spoke with George Harrison. But now, after George's death and 2 decades of reflection, Paul finally speaks. The words are tender, regretful, and healing. This is not about headlines or chart positions. This is about 2 boys from Liverpool who changed music forever and the private goodbye that happened far from cameras or microphones. Stay with us. What Paul reveals changes how you see not just their relationship, but the entire Beatles legacy. When we talk about the Beatles, we often speak in superlatives. The greatest band of all time, the most influential musicians of the 20th century, 4 icons who redefined what popular music could be. But beneath these grand statements lie 4 individual lives, each with their own triumphs, struggles, and relationships that were far more complex than any documentary or biography could fully capture. Paul McCartney and George Harrison's relationship spanned over 40 years. From teenagers playing skiffle in Liverpool, to global superstars, to estranged former bandmates, to reconciled friends. Their story contains the full spectrum of human connection, admiration and resentment, collaboration and competition, distance and reconciliation. Why does this final conversation matter so much? Because it represents something universal, the words we choose when time is running out, when pride and past conflicts fade against the backdrop of mortality. What do we say to those who've shaped our lives when we know it might be the last chance we get? And what does Paul's decision to finally share this moment tell us about how we process grief and legacy? Liverpool, 1954. A 12-year-old Paul McCartney rides the bus to school at the Liverpool Institute. On that same bus sits George Harrison, nearly 2 years younger, a quiet, thin boy with a distinct accent and quick wit. They weren't immediate friends, but Liverpool was a close-knit city where paths crossed frequently. "I'd see George on the bus," Paul recalled in a 2018 interview. "He was just this kid with big ears and a good sense of humor. We'd nod to each other. Liverpool kids weren't overly friendly at first. Their true connection began through music." By 1957, a 15-year-old McCartney had joined John Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen. One pivotal day, Paul brought George along to watch them play. George, though younger, was already an impressive guitarist. George got his guitar out and played Raunchy. This Bill Justice instrumental, Paul later recalled. "I remember being impressed, and John was too, although he didn't show it then." Despite his youth, a significant concern for Lennon, Harrison's skill earned him a place in the band by early 1958. At just 14, George became the youngest member of what would eventually transform into the Beatles. These early days in Liverpool set the template for their relationship. Paul was the slightly older, more confident musician who had brought George into the fold. George was the talented younger player, quiet but determined, already developing his distinct style. They bonded through long hours, practicing guitar together, working out chord structures and harmonies in their family homes, the warm tones of their guitars filling small Liverpool living rooms as they discovered their musical voices together. "We'd sit opposite each other with our guitars, and I'd teach him the chords I knew," Paul said in a 2021 interview. "Then soon enough, he'd be teaching me new ones he'd figured out. That's how we learned, together." But here's where it gets complicated. This friendship, built on mutual respect and musical passion, would soon be thrust into the pressure cooker of unprecedented fame, creative tension, and business complications that none of them could have imagined as teenagers in Liverpool. By 1963, everything had changed. The Beatles had exploded in Britain with Please Please Me reaching #1. What followed was a whirlwind that transformed 4 working-class Liverpool boys into global icons. Through Beatlemania, their American breakthrough in 1964, and their increasingly sophisticated studio work, the dynamics between the band members evolved in complex ways. Paul and George's relationship shifted during this meteoric rise. In the studio, McCartney's perfectionism and specific vision for songs sometimes clashed with Harrison's growing confidence as a guitarist and emerging songwriter. George later described these years as often frustrating, feeling like the kid in the group, having to fight for space for his compositions against the prolific Lennon-McCartney partnership. Picture this: Abbey Road Studios, 1966. The band is recording Taxman, one of George's compositions for Revolver. The track needs a guitar solo. Despite it being Harrison's song, it's Paul who steps in to play the blistering solo we know today. George stands at the mixing desk, watching Paul lay down the track. "I wasn't upset at all," George later said in a 1987 interview. "I knew Paul was a great guitarist and could get what we needed quickly. It wasn't about ego then. It was about getting the best sound for the record." But the moment represents the complex creative relationship they navigated. Paul's musical versatility and confidence could both enhance George's work and sometimes overshadow him. As the Beatles continued their artistic reinvention from the psychedelic innovations of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Pepper to the raw back-to-basics approach of Let It Be, George was undergoing his own personal transformation. His growing interest in Indian spirituality, introduced during the filming of Help in 1965, became a defining aspect of his identity. While all the Beatles briefly engaged with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's teachings, for George, it became a lifelong path. The others would see it as something interesting we were trying, like everything else in those days, Paul reflected years later. But for George, it was different. He'd found something that made sense of everything for him, and that changed him. For the better, I think. This spiritual awakening created both connection and distance between them. Paul respected George's dedication but didn't share the same level of commitment to Eastern philosophy. And that's when everything changed. The band that had been inseparable was beginning to follow different paths, personally and creatively. The Beatles' breakup in 1970 marked a painful chapter in both men's lives. The dissolution wasn't just about creative differences or business complications. It was the end of a brotherhood that had defined their lives since they were teenagers. After the split, Paul and George's relationship became particularly strained. While much attention has focused on the McCartney-Lennon tensions, the Paul-George dynamic carried its own unique complications. Harrison's landmark triple album, All Things Must Pass, 1970, showcased the wealth of material he had accumulated during Beatles years, songs that had often been passed over for Lennon-McCartney compositions. In his 1980 autobiography, I, Me, Mine, George notably mentioned every Beatle except Paul in the acknowledgments, a silence that spoke volumes about their relationship at that time. When asked about this omission years later, Harrison simply said, "Paul knows what happened. He doesn't need me to tell him." The 1970s saw them moving in different directions. Paul formed Wings with his wife Linda, continuing to create melodic, commercially successful music. George pursued his spiritual interests, organized the groundbreaking concert for Bangladesh in 1971, and released increasingly personal albums that reflected his philosophical outlook. Their paths would cross at various events throughout the decade, industry functions, mutual friends gatherings, but the easy camaraderie of their youth had been replaced by polite distance. They were two men who shared an extraordinary history but seemed uncertain how to relate to each other in its aftermath. "We were like family," Paul said in a 2012 interview. "And like family, sometimes you love each other, and sometimes you can't stand to be in the same room. But the bond never really breaks." A telling moment came during a gathering at Ringo Starr's home in the mid-1970s. Witnesses recalled George and Paul sitting at opposite ends of the room for much of the evening, before eventually finding themselves at the same table, guitars in hand, almost automatically falling into harmonizing on Everly Brothers songs they had played as teenagers. "It was like watching a conversation they couldn't have with words," one attendee later said, "but with music, they still spoke the same language." Stay with us, because what happened next would begin a gradual thawing that would eventually lead to their final, meaningful conversation. December 8, 1980. The assassination of John Lennon shattered the Beatles' world and created a void that could never be filled. For Paul and George, the loss of their bandmate, despite their complicated relationships with him, was devastating. After John died, everything else seemed small, Paul recalled in a 2020 interview. Petty disagreements, old business grudges, none of it mattered anymore. In the aftermath of Lennon's death, Paul and George's relationship began a slow, sometimes awkward healing process. They weren't suddenly best friends again, but the shared grief created a space for reconnection. They appeared together at various Beatles-related events throughout the 1980s and 90s, including their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. The Beatles anthology project in the mid-1990s brought Paul, George, and Ringo together for extensive interviews and to oversee the documentary about their career. During this period, they spent more time together than they had in years, revisiting their shared history and inevitably processing old wounds. Behind the scenes of the anthology recordings, a telling moment occurred that few have heard about. During a break in filming, Paul and George found themselves alone in a side room at Abbey Road Studios. A guitar was propped against the wall, the same model of Gibson that George had played in the early days. Without a word, George picked it up and started playing a gentle rendition of In Spite of All the Danger, one of the very first songs the Quarrymen had recorded. Paul quietly joined in, singing the melody they'd crafted as teenagers. When they finished, George simply nodded and said, "We weren't bad for kids, were we?" It was a small moment of acknowledgement of their shared roots and the musical bond that had started it all. It wasn't a big dramatic reconciliation, one anthology crew member later recalled. It was quieter than that. Just two old friends remembering who they'd been before the world knew their names. This period marked a warming in their relationship, but it wasn't the complete healing that many Beatles fans might imagine or hope for. Old habits and hurts don't disappear overnight, even with the perspective that comes from losing a bandmate. What no one saw coming was the next challenge they would face together, one that would lead to their final, poignant conversation. In 1997, George Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer. He initially responded well to treatment, and by 1998, he reported being cancer-free. Life seemed to return to normal, with George focusing on his gardens at Friar Park, his spiritual practices, and occasional musical projects. But in 1999, a more serious threat emerged. An intruder broke into George's home, stabbing him multiple times in a near-fatal attack. Paul reached out immediately after the incident, shocked by the violence inflicted on his old friend. It was one of those moments where everything else falls away, a source close to McCartney said. Paul was devastated and made sure George knew he was there for him. George recovered from the attack, but in private, his health was becoming a growing concern. By 2000, he was dealing with lung cancer that had metastasized to his brain. Throughout this period, information about his condition was tightly controlled, with only his closest circle aware of the severity of his illness. The public narrative and private reality were dramatically different. While fans knew Harrison was unwell, the extent of his illness remained largely hidden. George wanted it this way. Maintaining his privacy had always been important to him, especially regarding his health. Off-camera, Paul and George's relationship during this period was complicated by more than just George's illness. There were still unresolved business matters related to Apple Corps, the Beatles company. There were still moments of tension about how their shared history was portrayed in the media. They weren't in constant contact, Olivia Harrison, George's wife, mentioned in a 2011 interview. But there was respect there, and when it mattered, they were there for each other. As George's condition worsened in 2001, the walls that had sometimes stood between them began to lower. Time was running out, and both men knew it. The luxury of holding on to old grievances was fading against George's mortality. During this period, Paul made several visits to see George, some publicly known and others kept private at the family's request. These weren't always easy encounters. George's physical decline was difficult to witness, and the weight of their shared history created both connection and occasional awkwardness. George didn't want pity, one friend noted. Even then, he had his dignity and his humor. He wasn't interested in tearful goodbyes or dramatic reconciliations. That wasn't his way. Now, if you're wondering what actually transpired during their final meeting, what words were exchanged between two men who had shaped music history together, Paul kept that private for nearly 2 decades, until now. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His passing created a wave of global mourning, with tributes flowing from fellow musicians, spiritual leaders, and millions of fans who had been touched by his music and message. In the immediate aftermath, Paul's public comments were brief and respectful. He was a lovely guy and a very brave man, and had a wonderful sense of humor, McCartney told reporters outside his London home. He'll be sorely missed by everyone. But privately, Paul was processing a complex grief. The loss of George meant that half of the Beatles were now gone. The four boys from Liverpool were now too. The weight of this reality and what it meant for Paul's own sense of identity and mortality was profound. In the years that followed, Paul rarely spoke in detail about his final interactions with George. When asked in interviews, he would typically offer warm but general reflections on their friendship and George's talents. The specific nature of their last conversation remained private, a choice that spoke to both its personal significance and perhaps Paul's own ongoing process of coming to terms with the loss. During a quiet moment backstage before a 2002 concert, Paul was observed sitting alone with an acoustic guitar playing Something, George's masterpiece from Abbey Road. He wasn't rehearsing, there was no one else in the room. He was simply playing the song, eyes closed, as if in conversation with an absent friend. It was like watching someone read a letter they knew by heart, a crew member later said, something private happening in plain sight. The 2002 concert for George at Royal Albert Hall brought Paul together with Ringo, Eric Clapton, and many others who had been close to Harrison. Paul performed For You Blue and Something, famously starting on ukulele, an instrument George loved. While the concert was a public celebration of George's life and music, for Paul, it also represented a personal farewell. There's a different kind of conversation that happens through music, Paul reflected years later. Sometimes you can say things with notes that you can't quite put into words. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Paul continued to honor George's memory in various ways, performing his songs in concert, speaking warmly of him in interviews, acknowledging his contributions to the Beatles' legacy. But the specific details of their final meeting remained untold, and that's when everything changed. In a recent, in-depth interview, Paul finally decided to share the story of his last conversation with George, a private moment between two friends who had lived through an extraordinary shared history. In a 2023 interview for a Beatles documentary, Paul McCartney finally opened up about his last conversation with George Harrison. After more than 2 decades of keeping this moment private, he chose to share it, not as tabloid revelation, but as a tribute to their enduring connection. I saw him a few weeks before he died, Paul said, his voice softening. He was in Switzerland receiving treatment, and I came to visit. He was very thin, but he was still George, you know? Still had that twinkle in his eye. According to Paul, they sat together in George's room, looking out at Lake Geneva. Despite George's weakened state, they found themselves doing what they had always done best, talking about music. We weren't talking about the big things at first, Paul recalled. We were just chatting about guitars, about some ukulele George had found that he was excited about. Normal stuff, music stuff. But as the afternoon progressed, their conversation deepened. They reminisced about Liverpool, about learning chords together as teenagers, about the early gigs in Hamburg when they were still discovering who they were as musicians and as people. At one point, George said something like, "Remember when we thought the biggest thing in life was to have a hit record? How simple it all seemed then." Paul shared, "And we laughed about how young we'd been, how little we understood about what was coming." What Paul revealed next shows a side of their relationship rarely glimpsed by the public. As the visit was coming to an end, George apparently addressed some of the tension that had existed between them over the years. He said, "We had our ups and downs, but I always loved you. You know that, right?" Paul recalled, his voice catching slightly. And that was George, even then cutting right to the heart of it. According to Paul, he assured George that he knew, and that the feeling was mutual. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. Both men had mellowed with age, and had already moved past their most difficult periods years before. But it was an acknowledgement of their journey together, with all its complexities. The last thing he said to me was about music. He said, "Keep making music, Paul. The world needs your music," McCartney revealed. Coming from George, that meant everything. Paul emphasized that this conversation wasn't about settling scores or dramatic deathbed revelations. It was simpler and more profound than that. Two friends who had shared an extraordinary life experience, acknowledging their bond before saying goodbye. "I think we both knew it was probably the last time we'd see each other," Paul admitted. But it wasn't sad, strangely enough. It felt complete. When we look at Paul McCartney and George Harrison's relationship now, With the benefit of time and Paul's recent openness, we see something far more nuanced than the simplified narratives that have often surrounded the Beatles. Theirs wasn't just the story of a dominant songwriter and a quiet guitarist who lived in his shadow. It wasn't just about business disagreements or creative tensions. It was a lifelong connection that evolved through extraordinary circumstances. The problem with being a Beatle, Paul said in a 2022 interview, is that everyone thinks they know exactly what happened between us. But they only know the headlines, not the human stuff, and the human stuff is what mattered. What Paul's revelation about their final conversation shows us is that beneath the mythology of the Beatles, there were simply four men navigating friendship, creativity, success, and conflict like the rest of us, just on a global stage with the world watching. The truth is quieter than the headlines. George and Paul's relationship had dimensions that didn't fit neatly into magazine articles or documentaries. They were creative collaborators, occasional rivals, estranged partners, and reconciled friends at different points throughout their lives. George taught me a lot, Paul reflected recently. Everyone thinks it was always me teaching him, but that's not how it was. His approach to spirituality, his determination to grow as a musician on his own terms, his ability to cut through the nonsense. I learned from all of that. What emerges from Paul's willingness to finally share their last conversation is not just a clearer picture of their relationship, but a reminder of how we all grapple with the complexity of long-term connections in our lives. How do we balance the weight of shared history against personal growth and change? How do we reconcile past conflicts with present understanding? In George and Paul's case, the answer seems to have been acceptance of both the difficult periods and the enduring bond that transcended them. They were no longer the teenagers playing guitars in Liverpool living rooms, or the bandmates navigating the chaos of Beatlemania, or the estranged former partners dealing with legal complications. They were simply two men who had traveled an extraordinary road together, acknowledging that journey before the final parting. "I'm glad I had that moment with him," Paul said. In the end, all the other stuff, the business, the disagreements, it all falls away. What remains is the music we made together and the fact that we knew each other as well as anyone could. Their legacy isn't found in the myths or simplified narratives, but in this more human truth that even the most extraordinary lives come down to connections, to conversations, to moments of understanding before goodbye. For years, we've listened to the music Paul and George created, together and apart. We've analyzed their relationship through interviews, documentaries, and biographies. But sometimes the most meaningful moments happen in the quiet spaces between public narratives. A conversation beside a Swiss lake. Two old friends from Liverpool remembering where it all began. Words of acknowledgement and appreciation exchanged before time runs out. In sharing this final conversation, Paul hasn't diminished the mystery of their relationship. He's deepened our understanding of its humanity. The Beatles weren't just cultural icons or musical innovators. They were people navigating the same currents of connection and disconnection we all face, just on a different scale. Perhaps the next time you listen to Something, or Here Comes the Sun, or Yesterday, you might hear not just the brilliant compositions, but the echoes of two teenagers sitting opposite each other in Liverpool, teaching each other chords, unknowingly changing music forever. Their story, like their music, continues to resonate, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. What moment in Paul and George's journey speaks to you most? The early Liverpool days, their creative collaborations, or perhaps this final conversation, a quiet conclusion to one of music's most extraordinary relationships.